Welcome to this explainer. When you think of unemployment, what pops into your head? Probably a pretty straightforward picture, right? Somebody standing in an unemployment line, or maybe sitting on their couch firing off resumes. But in developing economies, unemployment doesn't always look like traditional joblessness. In fact, it's kind of like a shapeshifter. It can look like a bustling family farm or a perfectly operating street vendor. Today, we're going to unpack exactly why that is.
Okay, let's dive into this, because there's a fascinating contrast here that really challenges our basic assumptions. The traditional view of unemployment, simply having absolutely no job at all, that's really just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The reality in developing nations is far more complex. Unemployment actually exists on a spectrum of visibility. Sometimes it looks like that busy family farm we just mentioned, or maybe an overqualified barista working a double shift. It's an economic disguise. And to really understand how these economies function, we have to pull back that mask.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with number 1, the root problem. Then we'll move to number 2, highly visible unemployment. After that, we'll uncover number 3, the invisible, examine number 4, unused potential, and finally confront number 5, the education paradox. Let's kick things off with section 1, the root problem, which is structural unemployment.
Structural unemployment is a chronic situation where a huge number of people just can't get work because of limited job opportunities. At its core, it arises from a major shortage of capital equipment and other necessary resources. But what's absolutely crucial to grasp here is the stark contrast happening on the ground. In developing nations, the capacity to produce goods and services increases very slowly, mostly due to a low rate of capital formation. But at the exact same time, the labor force is just exploding because of rapid population expansion. Basically, the economy simply cannot build factories or businesses fast enough to match the sheer volume of new workers pouring into the market. And this isn't just a temporary hiccup, it is deep-rooted and chronic.
Now, this structural job loss is driven by some massive global forces. First up, technological advancements. Think of brand new automation in factories that ends up displacing traditional manufacturing workers. Second, we have changes in demand, like a sudden shift in consumer preferences away from physical newspapers, which absolutely devastated the printing industry. And third, globalization, where companies just outsource jobs to countries with even lower labor costs. Because this is a structural limitation of the economy's actual capacity, the only real solution is massive economic development that drastically increases overall production to absorb that rising labor force.
All right, moving on to section 2, highly visible unemployment, specifically open and seasonal unemployment.
This brings us to open unemployment, which is that traditional view we talked about earlier. It's exactly what it sounds like, a situation where workers have absolutely zero work to do. They are totally willing to work at the prevailing wage rate, but they're forced to remain jobless just because the work isn't there. You'll largely find this in urban areas and to a limited extent in rural ones. This category perfectly captures those familiar situations you probably know well. Think of recent college graduates hunting for their very first job or factory workers who've been laid off because of low product demand. It is highly visible and it's absolute. Right alongside that is seasonal unemployment. This happens when people are employed during certain days or months of the year but are completely unemployed the rest of the time. It's tied directly to the seasonal character of certain industries and a total lack of alternative work during what we call the slack season. To put that in perspective, think of a rice farmer in India. They work incredibly hard during the monsoon season, but they are entirely out of work when agricultural activity dies down in the winter. Or take the tourism industry, like hotel staff at a busy ski resort who suddenly face unemployment when the snow melts and the warm summer months hit.
So I want to pause here for a second and ask you, what happens when millions of people need work? The population is booming, but there are simply no open jobs available because of that structural deficit we just discussed. Where do they all go? Well, they don't just disappear, they adapt. And this perfectly bridges the gap to the hidden realities we're about to uncover.
That brings us to section 3, the invisible or disguised unemployment.
Disguised unemployment, which is also aptly called hidden unemployment, happens when more workers are engaged in a job than is actually required to do the work. Now, on the surface, these workers are apparently working. They're physically there, sweating, moving, doing tasks. But, and this is the key takeaway, if you were to pull some of them away and tell them to stop working, the total output wouldn't decrease whatsoever.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is the phrase, their marginal productivity is zero. Let's translate that heavy economic jargon into plain English. It literally means that the extra effort from that extra person adds absolutely nothing of value to the final product. The work was already getting done perfectly well without them. So they are technically working, but economically speaking, They are entirely redundant.
So why on earth does this happen? Well, there are 4 interrelated reasons, and we see this predominantly in the agricultural sector of developing nations like India. First, there's just a massive availability of a large labor force. Second, there's a total lack of alternative urban employment, meaning they can't just pack up and go to the city to find a factory job. Third, agriculture is heavily viewed as a family occupation, so naturally everyone pitches in. And fourth, they are working on very small land holdings. When you combine all that, you get multiple family members crowding a tiny plot of land that really only needs 1 or 2 people to farm. You also see this a lot in the informal sector. Imagine a crowded street with dozens of fruit vendors right next to each other, but virtually no customers. They look busy for sure, but their marginal productivity is effectively 0.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Unused Potential, which we call underemployment.
Underemployment exists when employed persons contribute less to production and income than they are truly capable of. They possess the abilities, they have the training, and the expertise, but because there is simply a lack of suitable work in the economy that actually matches their skills, they're forced to take inferior occupations. You can easily imagine the intense personal frustration of this situation, right? But on a macroeconomic scale, it represents a devastating underutilization of national talent.
Let's move to a few examples to see how this builds in a real-world context. Just look at the massive mismatch between qualifications and reality here. You might have a person holding a highly technical master's degree in engineering, but they're working a job that only requires a high school diploma. Or consider someone desperate for full-time employment, but due to financial constraints and a lack of opportunities, they're stuck in part-time work. This perfectly illustrates the massive, silent waste of human capital happening every single day.
And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, the education paradox, or educated unemployment. Educated unemployment refers to joblessness specifically among matriculate and higher educated individuals. And the bitter irony here is just hard to ignore. Think about it. A developing society actively invests its very scarce resources into mass education to lift its population up. However, due to a rapid expansion of educational facilities, combined with, frankly, a faulty education system that focuses way too much on general knowledge rather than practical vocational skills, you end up with a highly educated populace with absolutely no matching employment opportunities. And this brilliantly illustrates how this paradox traps highly skilled individuals at the absolute bottom of the career ladder. Look at this mismatch. A master's in economics working as a retail store cashier. A PhD in computer science forced into data entry or telemarketing. The education system succeeded in training them, for sure, but the structural economy fundamentally failed to absorb them. So the absolutely crucial question is, how do we fix a problem that has so many different faces? Well, the required remedies span across all the types we've discussed today. Whether it's the structural root, the disguised branches on that family farm, or the educated paradox in the cities, fixing it all relies entirely on increasing overall production capacity. The economy has to generate alternative urban employment to pull people out of those disguised agricultural jobs. It requires highly targeted economic development, investing in industries with high employment potential to actually absorb a rapidly expanding population.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this powerful question to think about. What is the long-term impact on a rapidly growing nation when its most valuable asset, its human capital, is consistently squandered through disguised, underemployed, and educated unemployment? When millions of capable minds and hands are left idle or hidden in plain sight, the compounding loss to economic prosperity is just staggering. It's like a giant puzzle, but understanding these shape-shifting realities is the very first step towards solving it. Thank you so much for learning with us today.